All that makes me think of the infamous quote by Clausewitz, the famous military historian and strategist, but that war is policy/politics by other means. And this is because this is where the war becomes more than just military. It becomes strategic psychology and increasingly a trap for Putin's own making. You would think that after 4 bloody years, after staggering casualties, persistent sanctions, drone saturation, economic strain, a war that neither side can decisively win would begin to burn itself out. But it hasn't. And the reason largely lies with this one man. Putin is caught increasingly in a vice of his own construction. I made a video last week about the cannibalization of Russia's economy. And this is the same thing. On the battlefield, the chances of producing something that can be credibly called a victory are waning. In Donetsk, the main axis of effort, Russia forces advanced 60 kilometers over the course of this campaign. Russia has been unable to generate sufficient combat power to break through Ukrainian lines. Inside the 10 to 30 kilometer drone kill zone, soldiers and equipment cannot mass without becoming targets immediately. Even when Russian units achieve local breaches, they struggle to exploit them. Tactical gains do not convert into operational breakthroughs. And so on its current trajectory, that does not change. For the first 3 years of this war, Russia was expanding its armed forces. But by the end of 2025, it was losing more men than it could recruit. Recruits now are also often poorly trained, morale is non-existent, and desertion rates have increased massively. Russia relies less on patriotic fervor and more on these financial inducements. According to some analysis, the average sign-on bonus has risen to roughly 2.4 million rubles. That's $30,000 a soldier. But that money has to come from somewhere. And therefore, the annual bill for recruitment incentives and military expansion now runs into the trillions of rubles, equivalent to the overwhelming majority of the entire federal deficit of the US. Defense spending now consumes roughly 8% of GDP. Debt servicing costs are rising. Oil revenue projections are completely out of the blue. The rest of the economy is stagnating. This triple header, as I call it, does not mean the imminent collapse, but it does not mean that Putin has the capacity to keep going, to continue to strike Ukraine and encourage the sign-up rate of more recruits who are being flung into the meat grinder. Putin retains the capacity to strike cities, energy infrastructure, to inflict that pain. But aerial bombardment alone is not likely to force capitulation. And his long-standing bet has been that Ukraine, facing manpower shortages, will collapse politically or militarily before Russia does. That's the idea of strategic patience. But this is 4 years in, and he cannot easily pivot to peace either now. Day by day, Ukraine becomes far less dependent on American intelligence and financing than it was at the start of the war. European military support has increased last year to such levels it completely replaced any and all provisions of American. Any durable settlement involving nebulous security guarantees would likely require legislative ratification in Washington. So it doesn't mean it's over. But fundamentally, peace itself carries risks for Putin more than Ukraine. Russia has retooled so much of its economy around defense production and war footing that transitioning away to some kind of peacetime would be not just economically disruptive, but implosive. Finding employment for people in a stagnating civilian economy would be difficult. History offers countless uncomfortable precedents. Disgruntled veterans having come back after 1917 or after the Soviet Union's failed efforts in Afghanistan in the 80s. Polls suggest many Russians would initially welcome an end to the fighting, but of course quickly questions would follow about the scale of the losses, the economic costs, about the over-reliance on China's financial and technological support, and about why a campaign itself presented as swift and absolutely imperative became as bloody and ambiguous as it has. That scrutiny could constrain Putin's ability to restart this war in the future, and it could produce politically critical to him, which leaves him therefore in a paradox. He cannot deliver the decisive victory he promised at the cost the system can sustainably bear. He cannot easily settle without risking internal stability, but he cannot escalate without further hollowing out of what remains of the state. And this is why the narrative of inevitable Russian victory is so important. If the war cannot be won cleanly, it must be reframed as inexorable. If progress is slow, it must be presented as steady. And if costs are high, they must be portrayed as necessary sacrifice in a civilization level struggle, something that we have seen Putin reference many a time. For Putin, the purpose is not just to influence Western leaders and policymaking. It is to manage domestic expectations, buy time. It is at the heart of any autocrat's survival. Because ultimately, Putin's readiness to continue depends on the level of pain he believes Russian society can absorb and the level of uncertainty he can impose on his opponents. If external pressure tightens through sanctions on oil exports, restrictions on the shadow fleet, coordinated financial enforcements, these economic vices tighten. And if Western leaders resist the narrative of inevitability and refuse to back what looks like a losing trajectory, the diplomatic environment doesn't just shift, it completely twists upside down. But forcing dictators is notoriously difficult. The longer the war continues, the more damage accumulates. And the clearer it may become to Russians themselves that endurance is very much not the same as success.